What's up, notJust developers? Today we're going to implement a complete authentication flow without a password based on only emails. So the user will sign in with his email, we're automatically going to create his account if he's a new user, and we're going to send him a one-time password to his email, and after confirming that, he is going to be authenticated in the application and will be able to do other requests. First of all, let's quickly review the whole flow of data, how it happens. So on the left here, we start with a user that will start the whole flow by providing his email to the endpoint, for example, /login. Our backend will check if there is no user in the database with that email, it will create one, or simply will use the user with that email that was provided. So this is the first benefit of passwordless email, because we handle both sign in and sign up workflows with the same endpoint. So that was the second step. The first step is our backend will create an email token and will save it in the database. The first step is to somehow get this token to the user, and you can do that by sending an email. In this diagram, it's SendGrid. For us, we're going to use AWS SES, simple email service, or you can use any other ways of delivering that code to the user email. After that, the user will open his email client, will copy the code, which can be 6 or 8-digit code, and in the application, he will paste that code. Now the application will send the second request to the /authenticate, including the email and the email token as the fifth step. Now the backend, as the sixth step, it will first of all check if the email token matches in our database the same email to make sure that we are receiving the request from the same user and nobody is trying to impersonate him. Then we're gonna generate a long-lived JWT token, and this JWT token we get back to the user. That is going to be used to authenticate future API requests. So later on, if he wants to create a post, if he wants to create a tweet, he will have to use that JWT token as the authentication token, and we're going to be able to look in the database, see, okay, that token represents to that user, he's authenticated, and we know who is making this request. I wouldn't call it simple, but that's the whole workflow, and we're going to take it step by step right now to implement. Firstly, let's go ahead and implement this in our backend, and later on we're going to implement this from the user UI perspective. This tutorial is brought to you by IBM Stepzen. With Stepzen, you can build APIs in literally minutes. All you have to do is run a CLI command and Stepzen will take care of the rest. It connects with a wide variety of data sources, starting with SQL databases, REST APIs, and even other GraphQL APIs. I've used it in multiple projects on this channel already, and I fell in love with how easy it is to build GraphQL APIs with IBM Stepzen. If you're interested, check out the link in the description below to get started for free, or check out this tutorial where we use Stepzen to build a Spotify clone. Now back to the tutorial. So in our application here we have our notJust backend using Express and Prisma to interact with our database. The first step actually is going to be to adjust our database schema to add the newly added features and to add the new model that will save the tokens in the database. Before we get into the tokens, because the way we create users in this workflow, at this moment in step 2, when we create a user, at that moment in time, we will only know the email of a user. We will not know the information like name, username, and so on. So for that reason, we have to mark all the other fields on the user model as optional. Is verified because it has a default, we can leave it as non-optional because it will default to false. So let's say every other field that are not defaulted or automatically managed, like updated at, created at, should be optional, so that we can create users only based on emails. In this situation, because we have unique on the username, we'll see if this will give us any errors, having an optional unique field. The next step is let's go ahead and create the model for our token. Well, the token will have an ID. Let's auto increment them. We will probably also have like created that and updated that for the token. So let's add the two fields that are automatically managed for us. Because we have two types of token. Remember that, like we have email tokens that are like one-time passwords, and they will be available for a very short amount of time, for example, for 10 minutes. And also we will have JWT tokens, which is long-lived tokens that will expire much later, like in 12 hours, or even like you can do like 30 days, or how long do you want to keep users logged in. So because we have two types of tokens, let's add a type string here. And if we will need to know like what type is this, is it an email? Can add here email or API, let's call them API. For email tokens, we would like to also save the value of that token to be able to find, because the second time the user calls authenticate, he will give us the email token, and based on that email token, we will have to search in the database for that specific token to see what user is that. So email token is going to be a string, and it's optional because the API token will not have it. And let's also make them unique, the email tokens. Yes. The next two fields are going to be used for validation, and the first one is whether the token is valid or not. And let's create it as a boolean, and let's default it with true, because when we create a token we expect it to be valid, and later on if something happens we want to have a possibility to make the token invalid. And besides having a valid boolean here, let's also specify when it expires. Expiration is going to be date time, so for short, like we're gonna calculate it based on when it was created. Lastly, speaking about relationships, one user will be able to have multiple tokens. For example, he will be able to request multiple tokens in a row, or in general, he can have an email token and an API token. So because the relationship between user and token is one-to-many, we're going to have here a user ID of type integer that will specify what user created that token. And let's also create the relationship to the user that will return the user itself using the relation. And the fields from this model is user ID and references the ID of a user. Now, because we have a relationship from token to user, we should also have a relationship from user to tokens as token like this. And that's everything that we need here. One remark here for the type, we specify a string. If your database accepts enums, it would be better to have an enum for the token type, in order to make sure that we only use these two types, for example, that we provide here. But because I'm using at the moment the SQLite connector, I cannot use enums. SQLite does not have enums. That's why I'm using string here. But when we will move to PostgreSQL, we're going to be able to use enums. So it's going to be better to use them. Perfect. So I think we have everything ready here with tokens, with our data model, and we can go ahead and let's clear everything, and we can go ahead and run the migration. Let's migrate dev with the name of tokens. Now, if we look at the Prisma Studio, we should also see that token model here with all the fields that we defined. The next step is to define our router that is going to be responsible for our authentication. So let's start with defining a file in our routes, auth routes.ts, and here we're going to import the router from Express. Let's create the router, and at the end we're going to export default router. Here we're going to define the endpoints for our routes, but let's first go ahead and connect this router to our main application in the index.ts by importing import auth routes from auth routes. Let's do app.use auth, and here auth routes. So back in our auth routes, let's think about what endpoints we will need here. If we look at the schema here, we see that we have two endpoints. The one that will initiate this flow and send the one-time password, basically the one that will generate the one-time password knowing the email, and then the second one that will exchange the one-time password, the email token, to a long-lived JWT token. So we need two endpoints. The first one, let's call it login. So router.post/login. And actually it's gonna be both sign in and sign up. So response, I want to provide a comment here. Create a user if it doesn't exist, generate the email token and send it to their email. That's going to be the goal of this login endpoint. And the second endpoint, the goal is going to be validate the email token and generate a long-lived JWT token. So this one is going to be a route.post, and here let's call it authenticate. Authenticate. Sync, request, response, and here we're gonna have to implement it. All right, let's start with the first one, login. If we look at the login, we see that the only data that we will receive here is the email of a user. So let's go ahead and get this email from the request.body. Now we need to generate a token. How do we do that? Well, I will provide you a simple function. I will put it here at the top that will generate a random 8-digit number as the email token. So basically, let's do const email token equal generate email token. You can adjust this function to return like less digits. For example, if you want a 6-digit, you will simply remove the amount of zeros from here. Besides the email token, basically what we are interested in here is to create a token. So the created token is going to be created by calling Prisma, and we don't have Prisma yet here. So let's quickly import Prisma client, initialize the client here like this. Now we will be able to call prisma.token.create, and using the data, let's provide here the data for this token. So if I look in the schema, what data do we need? ID will be auto-generated, created that, updated that as well. Type, what type? This is an email token. So for the type is going to be email. Then what do we need here? The email token, this one that we generated, which is a random 8-digit number, email token. And what else? Valid is going to default to true, and expiration. When is this token expiring? So for the expiration, let's do expiration here, and let's create a new date, and we want the token to expire 10 minutes later than it was created. So inside the new date, let's get the current time using new date as well, .get time to get the time, the current time. And here we're gonna add the amount of milliseconds that represents 10 minutes. So first of all, at the top here, probably I'm going to have some constants like email, token, expiration in minutes. So how much time? Let's give the user 10 minutes to use the one-time password. That's the crucial part of securing this way of authenticating, because if you provide this token with a very long expiration time frame, it increases the chances it's gonna be brute forced. But because we, in the expiration here, we're taking the current time and we are adding email token expiration in minutes, and then we have to transform this to milliseconds. So to transform to seconds, we need to multiply by 60. That's gonna be minus 2 seconds, and to transform to 1000. So that's gonna be our expiration. What else do we need here? The user ID. We will have to basically connect the user based on the email that he provided in the request body. So here we need to either find the user with that email and get his ID, or create a new user with that email and then get the ID and provide it here. A cool way to combine these two operations together in Prisma is using the user connection here. So instead of specifying the user that we want to connect to, we're going to specify directly the user. And here we can use the connect or create operation to basically, first of all, provide the where clause to understand how do we want to search. We're going to first search based on the email. If there is already a user with that email, then we're going to simply connect it with this token. Otherwise, we will create it. And here we need to specify the fields for the newly created user. And because we only know the email of that user, that's what we're going to use here. But as well, you can provide here, like, for example, a bio, like new user, let's say. That's also possible, even though I don't want to provide any extra fields, just for you to understand why we have this create here. The first time when the user will send his email, he's going to be created in the database and then connected with the token. And here we have a created token. What else? Let's at this moment do just console log the created token. But later on, we're going to have to send email token to user's email. We're going to do that in a moment. And lastly, we need to provide some response. So let's send the status code of 200 to say that everything is fine. Now let's go ahead and using an HTTP client, in my case, I'm going to use Thunder client. I'm going to create a new request on localhost 3000. Then we need to do authentication, because if we look in the index, our authentication routes is on the /auth. So that's why we have a first auth here. And if we look in the auth routes, our login is on the /login. So let's do /auth/login. It's a post request, and the body should only include the email. So let's include email here as vadim@notjust.dev. Now, if I look here in the users, there is no user with that email. And if I'm going to send this request, I receive status code 200. If I look in the database, we see that the user was created with the email. It doesn't have a name because we don't know the name and username and other details yet. Let me actually get rid of a lot of these things. If we look for this newly created user, there is one connected token. And if I open this one, we see that that is an email token with this code that basically should be sent to his email. And then providing this email token, we will be able to authenticate and understand that the user that is trying to log in is actually the owner of that email. User ID 8. And yeah, as well, if we look at the tokens here, you're going to see that newly created token. And yeah, that's the first step for us. As an additional step, when we create this token, I will probably put it into a try catch, just because our email tokens are randomly generated. In our schema, we said that email token should be unique. So in some cases, maybe we can land on the same token. So for that reason, let me put everything into a try catch. And if there is an error, let's console log the error and maybe also send the status 400, something bad happened. Okay, so that's the first step, generating email tokens. The next step is going to, we're going to move to the authentication, and at the end, we are going to implement this sending to the email. So we are skipping step 4 for a moment. We're going to get back to it by the end of this video, and we're going to go to the step 5 to implement the authenticate. And for this endpoint, the user will send his email and the email token that he received on his email. What we have to do with this endpoint, which I have set up here in our auth routes, we will have to first validate the email token and make sure that it is first of all valid, it is not expired, and it also belongs to the user that is sending the request. And after that, after we validated it, we should generate a long-lived JWT token with JWT and create a new API token and send the data to the user. Later, the user will be able to use this API token, this JWT token that we send, to use it to send requests to protected routes. For example, creating a post, getting users, and so on. starting with the data that we will receive, that's email and email token. Let's go ahead and get this email and email token from request.body. The first step I always do is console log to make sure that we are sending and receiving this data correctly, because without that, everything else is not gonna work. So console log email and email token, and here let's do response.send status 200. Now let's go ahead and create in the Thunder client. This one is login, so let me save it first. 1 second, and I'm going to reuse the same one, but this time we're not gonna use the login URL, but the authenticate. And besides the email, we're also going to have to send the email token. Initially, let's say it's 123, and later on we're gonna be able to update it. I'm going to save this one to collection as authenticate. All right, so let's go ahead and try to send this authenticate request, and we see okay. If I look in the development in the server, we see that the email that we're console logging here is correct, the one that we are sending, and the email token is 123. Knowing the email token, let's go ahead and query our database and find specifically that token in the database that matches the token that the user sent. How to do that? We're gonna also use Prisma for that. So const, let's call it database email token is equal to await prisma.token.query or find unique. Let's provide the where clause. So we only know the email token, so let's find it by email token. And let's also include the user, which is a relationship of the token, because we want to make sure that the user email from our database matches the email that we received in the request. Email token. I will delete this console log, and I can go ahead and do console.log db email token, and I can already do some kind of validations. For example, if we didn't find any token with that provided email token, for example, if db token is undefined, in that case, let's return a response.send status, and let's simply send a 401, which is unauthenticated. Let's go ahead and try to send this authenticate request, and we receive back unauthorized. Basically, because this 123, we don't have an email token like that. Perfect. Let's go ahead and grab this specific email token that we will receive on our email and use it in our request. Send it here. Perfect. Now it's to 200. Okay. Status okay. Everything is fine. And if we look at this console log for the database email token, we see that the information about the email token. One property here that we are also interested in is we want to make sure that the token is still valid. So we can add it here in our if statement, database email token, or is different than database email token dot valid. If we didn't find it, or if we found it but it's not valid, then return status 401. Now it still should work. Come on, 200. But if it's gonna be invalid here, valid, false, save. In that case, we're gonna receive unauthorized. Perfect. True. Save changes. The next way to validate it is based on the expiration. If the token is expired, we should also not authorize him, because maybe the token is in our database, but it's used too late. So how do we do that? Let's check if database email token dot expiration, if it's less than the current date, we can return also the status 404, response dot status 01, but we can also provide a more descriptive error message saying that token expired. So we're still validating it. And now if I'm gonna send token expired, because if I look in the database, the token is available until 1725, but now it's 1726. It's right 1 minute after the token expired. It was generated more than 10 minutes ago. So we can either update it there, or we can go and generate a new token by calling the login endpoint. So if I call login, I'll go into the database, and we will see that we have a newly created token with ID 2 that will expire at 17:37. 27 is 10 minutes from now, and that's correct. So let's go ahead and grab this new token, and let's go back to the authenticate here and use another email token. Basically what we did right now is we simulated the user requesting a new token, receiving it on his email, getting it from there, and then in the application sending the email token back. And what we received is status code 200. Perfect. Token is not expired. We are past this moment. The last step is to validate if the user from the database, because the token is connected with a user and that user has this email, if this email matches the email that the user is sending to the body. Because if it doesn't match, in that case, the user who is trying to authenticate is not the user that belongs to that token. So there is most probably a typo in the token. So this will prevent basically trying different combinations of tokens until you find one that is valid. What we want is to find one that is valid, that is actually yours. So that will limit the potential of getting brute forced for these email tokens. So how to do? If database email token .user.email, and here I think we will have to safely access it. In some situation it might not even have a user. So if it's different than the email that was provided in the request body here at the top, if it's different, then we can say not your token. I don't think it's correct to say not your token, because this way you are saying too much. And for a hacker, knowing that, hey, there is a token like that, but the email doesn't match, is actually good information for him. So instead of that, I'm going to remove this JSON, and I'm going to simply send the status for 1. So now if I authenticate, but I use a different email, if I'm going to send here unauthorized, and if I use the email that I provided for this token, is 200. Perfect. Okay, so the first part with the validation is done. These are the 3 validations that we are doing. First of all, we want to make sure that the token exists, it is valid, it is not expired, and it belongs to the user that claims to be that user. So that are the 4 steps to validate. Here we are sure that the user is the one that is saying to be, and he is the owner of that email. That's what we are sure at this moment. And the next step, if we are sure that he's the owner, we need to generate API token. So to generate an API token, we are going to, again, API token. We're gonna create it and save it in the database. So await prisma.token.create. For the data, what do we want to provide? First of all, the type, because this is API token. Then we also need the expiration. So the expiration, we can look at how we implemented the expiration for the previous token. So expiration, let's grab it from the previous one here. But in this case, this is not the email token, this is the authentication token, so it should be a long-lived token. So authentication expiration, let's do it in hours, or you can even do it in days. So I'm gonna say 12 hours by default, and this is going to impact how long do you want to keep users logged in. So if you want to keep them for longer, you can generate a longer authentication token here. Now let's go to our code here to generate API token, and here use that authentication expiration in hours. And because it's not in minutes, it's in hours, we have to multiply it by 1 more 60. So hours multiplied by 60, that's minutes, multiplied by 60, that's seconds, multiplied by 1000, that's milliseconds. That's how we are setting the expiration date in future based on the number of hours that we specified. Okay, type expiration, and lastly, we need to connect it with a user. So in this case, we're gonna simply connect it because at this moment we are sure that the user exists. So we're gonna connect it based on the email. API token. Let's try to send a request here and see if we are generating this API token. We have to send the request to the authenticate. So if I send, status goes okay. If I look in the database, we should see a new token with a type API. We don't have any data, like we don't have any actual tokens here, but why we need it to be saved in the database is for the ability to invalidate it. So if something happens, you can come to the database, you can do false here, and later when the user will try to do a request, the token is going to be invalidated. This is what's called stateful JWT token, stateful authentication token, which means that we're not simply in a dumb way authenticated only using a JWT token, but based on a data that we saved in the database. And this way we can always deactivate the token from the database. Another security measure here is because we already exchange the email token to an API token, it will be a good idea to invalidate the email token to make sure that that's it. Like it was used once, it shouldn't be able to be used anymore. So to do that, what we have to do is using prisma.token. Let's update the token where the ID of the token is the one that we got from the database. So database email token.id. And the data that we want to update here is we want to set valid to false. Now, if I'm gonna run another authenticate request here, we see token expired because yes, it's already expired. So let's try to simulate the flow from the beginning. First of all, we log in, then the user will receive on email the email token. At the moment, we're taking it directly from the database, and the user will come back to the application, will provide that email token in exchange to a long-lived token. Our database will generate an API token, it's generated here, and it should invalidate the email token that was used. And if we look at the valid, it's false. Perfect. Last step is to generate the JWT token. We want to send back the ID of this API token to the user saying like, hey, use this ID of your token, and whenever you do some requests, give me that ID so that I know that you are authenticated and I know who you are. Because knowing the token from the database, if we look at the token, we are able to see the user because it's connected with a user based on the user ID. The problem is that we cannot just simply send the API token ID there because that's not going to be secure. Like anyone would be able to send like these IDs. What we have to do is we have to basically not even encrypt, but encode this token that only our backend is going to know how to encode and decode it. The user will just have a very weird long set of numbers that is going to use whenever doing these requests, but the backend is going to be the one who is going to be able to decode it. So to do that, we have JWT, which is a library that can be installed using npm install JSON web token. Let's install it here. And let's scroll up here where we have this generate email token, because we're gonna define another function that will generate auth token and encode inside it the token ID that represents the ID in the database. Token ID. Basically any data can be encapsulated there. The token ID is a number and it should return a string back. To generate it, we're gonna use JWT, so let's make sure to import JWT from JSON web token. And here the JWT needs a payload. So the JWT payload is going to be an object with our token ID. We are gonna right away return using JWT.sign. We're gonna sign the payload, the JWT payload, using a secret. So this secret, JWT secret, is what makes sure that only our server can encode and decode this token. So this should be kept secretly, and usually you would take it from environment variable. For now, let's say it's super secret for now. I will have to update it a bit later and take it from environment. So JWT, the secret, and what? It has some additional options, like for example, the algorithm, HS256, and the no timestamp true. There is a way to also add expiration to these tokens, but because we are managing the expiration on the database layer, we will not expire the JWT tokens this way, so that's why we provide no timestamp true. This way, we are generating a JWT token So what we have to do is call this generate auth token at the end of our authenticate function, generate the token. So the auth token is going to be generate auth token. And here we need to send the token ID. The token ID from the database. So here we have API token that we just created. So we can take API token.id. Let's go ahead and right away actually send it as JSON. So token, let's just send the auth token like this. Now if I go to the authenticate, if I send the request, we also need to install the types for JSON web token. So let's go ahead and install the types as dev dependencies, and now it should be good to go. If I send unauthorized, because this email token is invalidated. So let's go ahead and simulate another login. Take the email token from the database, this one, the last one, go back to authenticate and provide the email token to our backend. Now it generated this authenticated token that inside contains the information of the API token of this one. So basically it contains token ID 7. And with that, we are finished with the second part of our flow. Real short, to recap what we did is the user will open the application, he will see an email field, and here the application will send to the /login the email. Our backend will generate the email token, will send it to the user email, to this email, and after the user gets that one-time password from the email, he is going to be able to put it in the application, and the application will send a new request to the /authenticate using the email and the email token. Our backend will validate to make sure that that is the user that is claiming to be, and will generate a new API token, will encode it into a JWT token, and will send it back to the user like this, auth token, this one. Now, the next step, the user, for all of the future requests to our backend, he should use this token as the authentication token in order to authenticate him, in order to say like who is doing this request. First of all, you don't want to allow anyone to do request. For example, right now, anyone knowing the URL of your API will be able to go ahead and create tweets. And that's a big problem because anyone can do that, and most definitely your API is going to be spammed. At the moment, we are sending the user ID as a field here. Another problem here is that I can say that the user ID is 1 or 5 or 7. And this way I am writing tweets for our users. I'm impersonating users. That's not how it should be. First of all, we should not send the user ID here anymore. And in the authentication tab, the user should send a bearer token here. And it's going to be the token received from the authenticate here. We put it here and we're going to be able to send it to the server. Now, if we send it, probably we see username and email should be unique. But what it says is that, okay, at the moment it's not yet implemented to work in this way. What we should do is we should take this authentication token, we should decode it, we should look in the database who is the user that this token belongs to, and then assign the newly created tweet with this content to that user. And this way we first of all make sure that only authenticated users are able to call our API, and second of all is to assign newly created objects to the person that is doing that request. So let's see how we can do that. First of all, I'm going to show how to do it inline in that function, and then later we're going to extract into a middleware to be able to be used for our endpoints as well. Now let's focus on this post new tweet. So let's open routes, tweet routes, and here in the create tweet, first of all, we're not going to get this user ID anymore. We're going to take it from here. Next step is how do we take the token from here? With this plugin, like we're sending it to the authentication, but in fact that's simply a header, and if we look here it should be a header like authentication and the authorization and the bearer token. So let's go ahead and take the auth header from request.headers, and we're going to access the authorization. Let's go ahead and console log this header. And in order not to do anything here, I'm going to say, actually, I'm going to comment everything out for now, for a second. Let's just resend status 200. Let's go ahead and execute this create tweet once again. We see 200, but what we're interested in is in the console log, because here we are console logging the auth header. And we see that this is the header that we received. It's a string containing two words, bearer, a space, and then the token that we are interested in. So let's go ahead and split this and take only the token. So the token is going to be our auth header dot split based on the empty space, white space. And then let's take the second value with the ID 1, because the first one is bearer and the second one is the actual token. To double check if everything is okay, we can go ahead and write token here. And let me add some comments here. Authentication. Now, if I send the create post again, we see that what? Here is the token. Okay. But what happens if there is no token? So we should validate that as well. So if token is null, or if token falsy value, we should return response with a send status 401. Because if someone is trying to send a tweet without the authentication, if I'm gonna remove it from here, then we're gonna receive 401 unauthorized. Back if we are using it, we see 200 okay. Let's go ahead and decode the token, the JWT token. And actually, I think I will call it JWT just to be more specific, because there are a lot of tokens. So to decode it, we're going to use a try-catch method because things can go wrong here. There might be invalid tokens. And if we receive an error, let's give unauthorized right away. In the previous step, we saw how to use JWT to basically sign and generate a JWT token. In this step, we have to do the opposite, basically to decode this token. We're gonna need the same JWT secret. So I'm gonna copy it from here in our tweet routes as well. Later on, we're gonna take it from environment. And what do we have to do to decode it? Payload equal await JWT that should be imported. So let's make sure to import JWT JSON web token. And what we have to say is .verify, and we want to verify the JWT token with the secret, JWT secret. Now let's go ahead and console payload. Let's open the terminal and try to send the create tweet again. The payload has the token ID with ID 7. If we look in the database, the token ID with ID 7 is this one, the API. The next step is knowing the token ID, we should query it from the database. So I'm going to remove a console log. Let's say const database token. The token from the database is going to be taken from our database using prisma.token.find unique based on the ID, where ID is payload.token ID, and that if it exists, because if it doesn't exist, we also should stop here. But we're gonna assume that it exists, and let's also include the user of that token. So include user to take the information about the user who is the owner of that token. Now we can go ahead and do console log db token and check here by sending one more request. Token ID. Yeah, probably we're gonna have to make sure that if payload doesn't have a token ID, why is it a string? I need to specify the types here, but we can take as token ID number. Let's consider it as a number. Token ID, include user and database token. Okay, let's now check what information we console log when we send this query. Okay, based on the ID 7, we queried the token from the database, and also we know who is the user doing this request. Now it's very clear, like, okay, this user with this ID is doing this request, so we can go ahead and assign it to the post. Before that, also we should make sure to validate that the token is valid and is not expired. And to do that, let's go ahead and implement some additional checks here. If database token, which can be null, valid. If it's not valid, then let's do return response.status 401, and let's also provide some information. Error, API token expired. Maybe there is a specific API code for this, but for now it's gonna be okay like this. And also we should check if it's not expired, API token invalid or not valid, because we should also check if database token dot expiration is less than new date, then the token is expired. We can actually do them together because in both cases, the token should be regenerated by the client. So if API token expired is the error, then the client should make sure to redirect to the authentication screen and start the process again because the user has an expired API token. So what we are interested in here is in console log in the database token dot user. This is the thing that we are interested in. So if I do create tweet now, the user automatically is detected based on the token that we send here. Perfect. Before I go ahead and get this user into the data for the tweet that is going to be created, I really want to separate the logic of creating a post with the authentication logic, because all of this code is responsible for authentication. And when we mix and match different responsibilities, that's not good. We should separate and everything should have one single responsibility. And moreover, all of this authentication should happen not only on this endpoint, but also on other endpoints as well. So in order to separate the authentication logic, what we can do is we can create a middleware, which is basically a function that we can indicate that, okay, this function, like the request should go first from this middleware, do the logic there, which is our authentication logic, and after that execute everything else. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a new folder, middlewares. And let's do auth middleware.ts. The middleware is looks very similar to how a handler function like this looks with request response. So let's go ahead in the auth middleware and export function authenticate token. And this will receive request response, but also the next function. And the next is how we send the request to the next handler, to the next middleware. We don't want to stop here. We just want to execute some logic and then pass it to the next thing. Let's go ahead and also import the types for request response and the next function. And make sure to type them properly. This one is a request, this one is a response, and this one is a next function. Now let's go ahead and move all the logic from tweet routes that is related to authentication. So everything started with authentication here, all the way till the end of the catch here. We're gonna put in the auth middleware. Everything is still probably going to work because we still have a request, we still have access to the same headers to take the token and so on. But yeah, let's make sure to import the JWT as well. So from tweet routes here, the JWT and the JWT secret, and the JWT secret should be here. Prisma, we need Prisma here. So Prisma client, let's do it like this. I don't need the router, I only need Prisma client, which I can import a bit to the top, and Prisma here. Okay, everything else is working. So here I have console log database user. Because we took it out from our create a post tweet, if I'm gonna look in the terminal when sending this request, I'm not gonna see that console log anymore because we separated it into a middleware. The next step is to assign this middleware to different routes that we want to protect with the authentication. So in the index, what we can do is let's import authenticate token like this. Wrote it wrongly, but it's okay. So what we can do now is we can add this middleware to different kind of endpoints. We can directly add to specific endpoints or even to route endpoints like this user. We want all the requests that are going to the user and the tweet to be authenticated. So let's add firstly the authenticate token, and then the request is going to be passed to the user routes, and the same for the tweets. We don't want to add it to the authentication because in that case the user is not yet authenticated. So we need to allow unauthenticated request to these routes, but to the rest of the routes here we want to authenticate the user. Now, what we should see, if I call the same create tweet, we should see the information about the user. The question is, how do we get the information about the user from the middleware, for the authenticate token middleware, all the way till the router post here in order to be able to add the user ID here? Like, how do we get it from there to here? What we can do is we can attach different variables to the request. So in the middleware, we can attach to this request different variables, and the same request is going to be passed to the next handler and they will have access to it. So what we can do here is do request.user equal dbtoken.user. So I don't even need to console log anymore. I will do it like this. The only thing is that TypeScript complains because request by default doesn't have a field user. And in a real world scenario, what you will have to do is to create an extension of that type. For example, type of request is equal to the request from Express and user that will represent the Prisma user. So from Prisma, can we get the type of a user? Yes, we can. So a user of type user, and it's probably optional. So now if we type our request with this auth request, we're going to be able to assign the request user as the database user here. Going back to our tweet routes, what we can do is we can take the user from request.user. And here in the user ID, we can specify user ID is user.id. Here as well, like you should type this request with authenticated request, but I'm gonna simply ignore the TypeScript for a moment here just to see if it works. So to do manage user based on the authentication user, that's exactly what we're doing here. So now if I do post a tweet, processing, what's happening? I don't like that it's taking so long. Oh, I know why. In the middleware, what we forgot to do is we forgot to call the function next to send the request to the next function. So at the end, we simply do next to call the next handler, which is going to call the actual creating the tweet here. So if I do start now, we see user ID 8. So it automatically, based on the authentication token, created that tweet and assigned it to the authenticated user. And if we look in the Prisma Studio for the tweets, in the tweets, we see that the latest tweet that was created is assigned to the user that we logged in with. And let's do the same with the second one. For example, hello@world.com. Let's test if it will work as well. So to simulate the whole process, first of all, the user will sign in. So for example, it will sign in with hello@world.com. I'm gonna send 200. The user will receive a code on email, but for now, let's go ahead and just take it from the database. This is the latest code. Let's go back to our API. And the second step is to authenticate. Authentication works based on the code that you received on the email. Yeah, it doesn't work because I also have to provide the same email. So it's hello@world.com. Send. In exchange, we get the authentication token. Based on this authentication token, the next request that we're gonna do, for example, creating a tweet, in the authentication, we can specify this token. And now the content, I am hello world. If I do send here, we see that the user ID is 1. And actually, if we look in the database, user ID with ID 1 is this hello world. Yeah, again, if we look at the tweets, I am world is linked to the user that authenticated that request. Perfect. So this way we have managed to close the whole loop from 1 to 8, with the exception of sending that token to the actual email. So far we are logging, we are authenticating, we are creating tokens, we are parsing the token to be able to authenticate requests. And the last step is simply to send the token to the user by email. Actually, before we move on, I promised that we're gonna switch from a hard-coded secret to a secret that we take from the environment. So for example, for this JWT secret, what we're gonna do is let's take it from process.env.jwt secret. And the same, this is in our auth routes, but the same should be true for the auth routes and the middleware auth middleware. Let me console log it. just to make sure that we are getting it. By providing an environment variable, your server will automatically take it from there. This is basically a must in order to make the signing process of JWT secure. Because if you hard code it in your source code, and if someone else has access to the source code, you lose the benefit of this secret. So taking it from process environment, first of all, we're gonna have to define this environment. So in the .environment file, what we can do is with JWT token, let's say that it's env secret, let's say it like this. And we need to provide a default value, because if there is no process environment, we still want to use some kind of super secret. So let's do, if it's not in the environment, it's super secret. Just to make sure that TypeScript doesn't complain that this secret might be undefined, but always provide it for environments. And what I'm gonna do here is, I should do the same actually in the auth routes. And yeah, I see that the secret is actually coming from the environment, which we specified in the .env here. So that means that they are connected correctly, and now the secret is going to come from the environment console log, and everything is going to be the same. The last step on our backend side for implementing this passwordless authentication is to actually deliver the email token that we generate, that 8-digit code, and send it to the user email. We can do that through different email providers and APIs. For example, SendGrid is one of the possible solutions. But what I'm going to teach you today is AWS SES, a service that helps us send emails. That's what it's called, SES, Simple Email Service. Not sure how simple it is, but I will try today to make it super simple for you. But the benefit of it is it's much cheaper to send emails with SES rather than SendGrid. And also they provide a lot of free emails in the free tier. So what do we need here is we're gonna go ahead and sign in our AWS account. If you don't have one, it's free to create one. Yes, you have to attach your credit card. However, if you stay under the free tier, you're not gonna get charged. So let's go ahead and here in the console, let's search for SES. It's Amazon Simple Email Service. Let's open it up. And what we have to do first is we have to verify an email address from which we are going to send emails. If you have a domain, that's even better. You can verify a whole domain the same way as I have here. Now using SES, I can easily send emails from any notJust.dev emails. But at the same time, you can simply send emails from a verified email address. So to do that, press on Create Identity, select email address, specify your email here, and press Create Identity. After that, you will have to verify this identity by simply going to your email address, and you'll receive a URL that you have to simply press there to confirm that that email is yours. After that, you're going to come back to this dashboard and you're going to see that the identity status of this one is verified. This is an important part because without a verified identity, you're not going to be able to send emails. Another thing that I want to mention is by default, your account is in sandbox mode. As you can see here, I can request production access because my account is in sandbox mode. Being in sandbox mode allows you to send emails only to the verified identities. So I'm only going to be able to send emails to myself or other email addresses that I add here. So if you have two email addresses, go ahead and add them here to be able to test your application with different email addresses. After you're finished with development and everything is working, go ahead and move a request production access to be able to send emails to anyone. That's as simple as that. On AWS, that's everything that we have to do until this moment to configure simple email service. Now what we have to do is we're gonna use the AWS JavaScript SDK, this one, to connect to SES from our notJust application. Let's go in our application and let's install the SDK. So to do that, let's run npm install, and we will install the AWS-SDK/client-SES. We need the SES client to be able to connect. I'm not gonna wait because I'm pretty sure it's gonna succeed. Let's go ahead and in source, create a new folder for our services. The first service that we're gonna create is the email service.ts. What this email service will do is will export a function that will help us send the email token to the user email. So let's export this function, which is going to be an async function called send email token. The function will receive a user email where we have to send as a string, and that token that we need to specify as well, it's a string. Here, let's go ahead and console log to make sure that it's working. Console log, email, and also the token. In a moment, we're going to connect this one with our application where we actually have to send the email. But for now, let me simply call this send email token to, I don't know, vadim at notjust.dev, and the token is going to be 123. And by calling this function here, I can open a new terminal or even here, and I can do ts node or npx ts node source, then services, then email service.ts. So by executing this file, we're going to execute this function, and we see email. Perfect. We're going to need that in a moment, but for now, let's go ahead and import the SES client from AWS SDK client SES. Let's go ahead and create this SES using SES client. Like, we have to initialize it as a new SES client, and here pass some parameters if needed. In this send email token, using this SES client, we're going to be able to execute ses.send, but this function expects, and actually we will have to return await, and this function send expects a command that will specify to which email address, what subject, what body, and so on. Let's go ahead and define a function that will help us create the command, because there is a lot of properties there. The function here on the top is going to be create send email command that will receive some parameters and should return a new send email command. This send email command here is where we will specify all the properties of the email that we want to send, starting with the destination. To whom do we want to send? The destination here, we can specify the two addresses, which is an array of addresses. And if I'm not mistaken, you can send at the same time up to 50 email addresses, but we want only to one email addresses. The address to which we will send, we're going to receive as a parameter here. To address is a string, so let's just say to address. Besides the to address, you can also provide CC addresses if that's what you need. In my case, I don't need that at the moment. Who is sending this email? So the source should be from address, which again we're going to receive as a parameter here. This should be an email address that is going to be used to send the email to. Because if you have verified a domain name, you can basically send from different emails on that domain. And here you need to specify, is it from info, is it from payroll or invoices, or from your personal email address, and so on. Lastly, we need to specify the message that we want to send. But the message is composed of a body and of a subject. Let's start with the subject, because the subject is easy. The subject needs, we need to specify the charsat, UTF-8, and the data is the string that needs to be there. We can hard code it here, your one-time password, or you can also receive it through properties here to be able to adjust it. I forgot here a comma. The body, you can specify the body in multiple ways. For example, a text body, you can specify a HTML body, or other ways of formatting the message. I'm gonna be okay with simply text message as well. We need to specify the charset UTF-8 and the data, which is going to be the content of this or message. Let's call it message. The message is something that we're going to receive through parameters. So let's do message string. Now that's the whole email message. So let's go ahead and call this create send email command in our send email token. So const command equal create email command to which address? To this email that we want to send. From which address? Well, I'm going to use a hard-coded value of my email that I'm verified here as well. Use the email that you verified in your account, email. And for the message, let's go ahead and create it. Message equal, let's say your one-time password is this one. So let's take the message and send it as the third parameter. Now I think everything is put together except a catch here. Catch error. And what should happen in the error? Let's say console log error sending email, and maybe even the error itself. And maybe we can return the error as well. Okay, so let's give it a try. Actually, I was saying that I will show you how it fails. So for that, I removed my credentials for AWS in order to make sure that we are all on the same page. Now let me try to execute this file again and see if we get any errors. Email, and we see the error. Error sending email, credential providers could not load credential from any provider. That means that we didn't authenticate with our AWS account from this project. There are multiple ways how you can set up your provider, but first of all, what you have to do is in your console, you need to go to YAM dashboard, which stands from Identity and Access Management. Here in YAM, what you have to do is you have to create a user. So under the users, you're gonna create a new user. I'm gonna call it test. You don't want to select this one because you don't want this user to be able to log in. You want it to have only programmatic access. Let's press next. And let's, instead of add, you can add it to an admin group if you have one, or you can attach policies directly. The easiest way is to say administrator access, and this will give this user permission to everything. The best way to do it and the most secure way to do it is to give a user access only to things that he needs access to. So in this case, I will search SES and we see Amazon SES. We can go with full access for now. So let's select this policy that gives this user access to SES only and not other services. Let's go ahead and click next, create user. This user is created here. And what we have to do is security credential. Let's open it up, go to security credentials and create an access key. Click on create access key, and here it will ask you how you want to access it. We want to access it local code. You plan to use this access key to enable application code in local development environment to access your AWS account. We recommend an alternative, but for now that's good. So I understand the above recommendation and want to proceed. Let's go click next. Descriptive tag value local, and let's create access key. What it does right now, it generated the access key and the secret for it. What we have to do is we have to use them to authenticate our request to AWS. There is a couple of ways how we can do that, and I really want to find that in the documentation. AWS SDK, let me quickly start. Because you can do that through globally in your AWS config file or directly in your project, and doing it in your project I think makes more sense if this is something specifically for this project. Where is it? AWS SDK, JavaScript. So this is actually showing how we can create a shared credential file to use when sending emails through SES. So what you have to do is create a file with this content, with profile default, AWS access key ID, copying the access key ID and the secret access key ID from the page that we just created here. This is access key, secret access key, and save it under, if you are on Linux, Mac OS, or Unix, save it under the home directory in the directory .aws/credentials. This is the file that holds your credentials, and if you have them there, it's gonna work automatically. Another way to authenticate is, I don't see it here, but it's also providing them as environment variables, and it should be AWS access key ID and AWS secret access key. Is it like this? AWS secret access key. I'm gonna copy paste my secret. For example, the key ID, you can take it from here, put it in a string, and the secret access key, I'm gonna try to not show it. Hide and close the end file. Now let's go ahead and try to execute the same file once again, but this time we created a YAM user and we set the access keys in our end file, and it doesn't work. What if these variables were not loaded in our email service? So if I do here console log process dot .env.aws access key. If I run, yeah, most probably they are not loaded there. Undefined, as you see. Yes, when running the application, I think it should work, but by default, when running this file, it's not gonna take that .env file. Most probably, I'm just gonna have to use the npm.env to load the variables, even if they are not loading yet. So let's install .env as a development environment, and we need to require .env and configure. We're gonna have to do that at the top here before initializing the SES. And now if I'm going to try to do it again, to execute this file, the .env should load, should populate this access key, and we don't have any errors, meaning that we correctly authenticated and sent the email. So the next step is to actually go ahead and check the email. I'm gonna open my phone and see, yes, I received it. It has a warning, like be careful, because we are still in sandbox, and if we're going to production, this warning shouldn't be here. But the password, yeah, if the email is the exactly one that we are sending there, like email code 123, as you can see right away. So that means that we are sending emails correctly. The last step is, instead of calling this send email token here, what we should do is in our routes, auth routes, we need to import send email token from services, email service, and yeah, that's it. And simply call this function at the end of a login when we generate the created token and where we have this to do. So we need to await send email token, and to whom? Send email token. We need to import it by destructuring send email token, expects two arguments: the email to whom we want to send, and that is the email, and the token that we generated. So the token is email token. And just like that, the whole process should work without us having to look in the database. So let's simulate everything from the beginning, starting with a login by dim at notJust.dev. Let's press send. Processing. Okay, on my email, I will receive the one-time password. It's here, and the one-time password I will use to authenticate here. So the email was Vadim, and the email token is, oh my god, it's so long, 83. Maybe it's a good idea to generate 6-digit code. 8324499. Hopefully I did it correctly. Now I can press send. It generated for me an authentication token, and I can go ahead and basically create a tweet. I am in authentication. I should replace the token with a newly generated one. And if I do send, the user ID is 8 and the tweet ID is 6. I will go ahead and get the tweet with ID 6. Unauthorized, because we need to provide the authentication token with bearer. So let's take the same from here, and we see that the user is the one with email that we signed up. With that being said, we finally connected all the dots in our backend, started with a login, generating a token, sending it through email to the user using SES, then the user authenticating, sending this email token. We are generating the JWT token that we are saving in the database, sending it back, and the user can use it to authenticate future requests. Oh my god, that was such a journey. But finally, the backend side is done. And in the next step, we're going to implement it in the React Native side to call all of these functions and see how we can do it from the client side. So let's get into the user interface of our passwordless authentication flow. What we have to do is we have to develop two screens in our application. One that will start the request, that will request a one-time password, and the second one where the user will be able to input the one-time password and receive the JWT token that the application is going to use to further sign requests that he's going to make to our server. So yeah, let's start by developing these two screens, the user interface, then we're gonna make the requests, and lastly, we're gonna make the logic of handling, protecting our routes, and handling the authentication flows. So in our application, what we have to do is let's open our app directory and Again, like for this application that I'm using for this demo, we are using Expo Router, but if your application is using something else, you can completely use a different rack navigation as well, for example. So let's go ahead and here create a new group of files that will handle the authentication. So let's create a new folder, auth. And here we're gonna have two screens. One of them, let's say sign in screen, signin.tsx, and the other one is going to be the second screen where users can input the email code. So on the backend we call that authenticate.tsx. So let's keep it the same. Let's define two basic components here, React Native Functional Export, and here React Native Functional Export. Should be capital. Same here. As a temporary solution, in the index.tsx, I'm going to redirect actually to our sign in page in order to see it always on the screen. So if I'm gonna refresh right now, we should be redirected to the sign in, and here we see this sign in text. Okay, so on this sign in page, what we need two things. We need one text field where the user will be able to input the email, and a button that he'll press to start the flow. So let's go ahead and start with a text input, define a text input. And here for the placeholder, we're gonna use email. Let's make sure to import text input from React Native like this. And for the text, let's do sign in or create an account, because this flow will both sign the user in or will create an account if he doesn't have one. Create an account. Lastly, what we're gonna need is a button at the bottom. So let's use a pressable component from React Native, and inside the pressable a text saying sign in. Okay, for the styles, I'm gonna go ahead and provide you with all the styles that you need. Not to waste time on the styles, like it's pretty basic, but still it would take us a lot of time. So style sheet here. And let's go ahead and provide to the top view styles.container. Then for the text, style.label. For the text input, let's input. Pressable will be style.button, and lastly here button text. And just like that, we have a pretty simple page where we can write our email. That's not everything, because we have to bind a state variable to this text input to get the email that user is typing. So for that, we're gonna define the email state, and initially it's going to be an empty string. Let's make sure to import useState from React, and the email value we're gonna send to our text input as value. So let's say value equal to email, and on change text is going to call our setter. So every time we change the text, it's going to update the state variable. Now, if I write, yes, everything is working. And the pressable will call a function that we have to define here. So let's do on sign in. It's going to be an async function that at the moment, let's simply console warn sign in, and maybe even the email. Let's make sure that whenever we press on this pressable, on press, we call the on sign in function. Now, if I write my email here, press sign in, we see my email at the bottom. So with a user interface for our sign in page, I think we are done. So let's go ahead and copy everything and move everything to authentication as well, because the authentication is going to be another page that instead of requesting the email, it will request the user code. So what I will do is in the index, let's do the redirect to the /authenticate to make sure to see it here on the screen. And inside the authentication, what? Let's start by changing the state variable from email to code, set code. And here the user will be redirected automatically, and he will be able to authenticate using this code. Text input, the placeholder will be email code, set code. Confirm your email. Maybe you can provide extra details like, hey, we sent a code to that email, and that's what you have to add here. And here, instead of a button sign in, confirm. Sign in, let's do on confirm. confirm your email, and here you'll press email code. One thing to note is that when we send this authenticate request to the server using the email token, we also have to specify the email. So one way would be to have a text input for the email on this page, but that wouldn't be very user-friendly because in the previous screen, he just wrote the email. So actually from the index, let me go back to the sign in screen. And in the sign in, what we want to do is the email that the user will write in this field, we want to send as a parameter to the next screen, so the next screen has access to it and doesn't ask the user one more time for the same email. So how do we do that? First of all, let's see how we can navigate from this screen to the second one. And I'm going to import use router from export router. Firstly, we need access to this router. So at the top, use router. And inside the onSign-in function, we can call the router.push, and let's push the authenticate screen. So now if I press on the sign in here, we should be redirected to the authenticate, and now I can go back to this one and so on. But how do we send data there? Well, to send data, we can pass here, instead of a string, an object, and this string will become the path name. And the second parameter, we can add params here. And one of the params can be the email. Now we are sending this email there, but how do we get it in the next screen? In export router, we get that using the use search params from export router. So let's get the email from use search params. So here in authenticate, let's try to console log email and code. Now we are on the sign in page. If I write here ABC sign in, we are redirected to the next one. And here, if I will write 1, 2, 3 confirm, as you can see, the console log here is authenticate ABC 1, 2, 3, which means that at this moment in time, we have access both to the email and to the code. That's exactly what we will need here to authenticate and get back the authentication token. I wanted to maybe update a bit the titles and the headers of these pages. So to do that in the root layout, I'm going to add a new stack screen here, stack.screen. The name is going to be the name of this route. So authentication is skipped because it's within parentheses, but in this case is sign in. So this way I can provide React navigation options to my sign-in screen. And for the sign-in, I want probably to hide the header. So header shown. And let me copy paste this one more time for the authenticate. And instead of hiding the header, I'll provide a title confirm. I don't know. Oh, actually, it should be authentication/yes, because that's the name of it. It's not the path of the screen, but the name. So now the first one doesn't have a header. The second one is going to have a header with title confirm, and I can go back from there. Awesome. Now I can go ahead and commit. So once our user interface of our authentication screens is ready, let's go ahead and implement the backend requests that we're going to need to interact with our backend. So for that, I'm going to start with defining a new API library here for our authentication.ts. And here we're going to have two functions. One of them is going to be the login function, which is async. And as a parameter, it will receive a data, which is going to contain the email. And the second function that we're going to need here is the authenticate, which again is async. It will receive data, but in this case, the data will contain both email string and also the email token string. Let's make sure that this data, email and email token, is the same as we have here, email and email token. Perfect. So let's go ahead and implement these things. What we will need here is the API URL. So let's import API URL from config, which is a file here with a URL. Now it's localhost, but if we're gonna host the backend, it's gonna be changed. And for the login, what we have to do, if we look in our backend, we have to send a post request to the /login endpoint using the email as the body. Let's go ahead and do that. Response equal await fetch. What do we want to fetch? We want to fetch the API URL then /authentication auth/login. I'm taking this one from this URL. And for the options, what do we need there? Well, first of all, let's provide the header with the content type, which should be application/JSON. And we don't need the authentication header here because these endpoints do not require the user to be authenticated yet. That's what we are doing this request. But what we need is the body. It's going to be the JSON stringify version of our data that we receive as parameters data. Okay, let's do some basic error checking, because if the response.status is different than 200, if there was an error, then let's go ahead and throw a new error, errors during the login process. Otherwise, doesn't have to do anything. We are simply returning OK. Okay, let's copy the same logic in the authenticate because it's going to be pretty similar. So what we will do is we're going to do a fetch on the auth/authenticate. So if I look here, authenticate is going to be post request on the authenticate email and email token. And I think I forgot to send the method should be post. And the same here for the second one, method post. So we stringify the data, we send it. If it's not 200, there was an error. Otherwise, let's go ahead and return the response JSON because it's important. It contains the authentication token. So let's return the response.json. Okay, so with the low-level logic of fetching our API, we are done and we can move on to our screens. Let's go ahead in our authentication to the sign-in screen, and this is the first step. What we have to do is we have to simply import this login function from our API and call it here when the user presses sign in. So now in our sign-in function, let's go ahead and import the newly created login function from our library API authentication. And what we have to do is here on sign in, we're going to call login function and we're gonna send the data with our email. Let's make sure to await, and because this login function can throw an error, we have to put it into a try catch. Try here. We're gonna put the router push in the try because we want to navigate to the second screen only if the login succeeds, and in the catch we can catch the error and simply using an alert we can provide alert and we can do error.message. Make sure to import alert from React Native. I'm doing here very basic error handling using an alert, but you can save it into a state and display it on the user interface as well. So now in our application, if I'm going to use my email here, it actually redirected to the confirm page. And if I look at the backend in the logs, we see that right now, a couple of seconds ago, we received a new request and everything was successful. So let's do the same thing on the authenticate page. And here in the confirm, what we have to do is we have to import authenticate from our library, which will call our backend. And inside our onConfirm function, let's go ahead and do a try catch first. Again, very basic alert error handling. Let's make sure to import alert from React Native. And inside this try, what we're gonna do is we're gonna call the authenticate method. We're gonna send here the body containing the email and the email token. The email token, we're gonna take it from the state. Here, TypeScript is complaining because this email from search params can be either string or undefined. So I can do a check here if type of email is different than a string. I can return here. And let's go ahead and console log the response to see what we get back. So if I press sign in here, we're redirected to the next page. If I do some kind of code, press confirm, email code doesn't match. But if I'm going to use the code that I received on email, which is this one, we didn't see the alert. And if I will look in the logs, we should see this log with the authentication token. And this is exactly the authentication token that we will need for next request to authenticate our request to our API. So that means that the whole flow now is connected and working properly, from creating an account and requesting a one-time password on our email to validating that password here on the second page and exchanging it to a JWT token. The only thing next is to save this JWT token somewhere, use it for the next requests, and also to manage the whole authentication flow and protect some of our application routes based on whether the user is authenticated or not. Okay, let me go ahead and git commit authentication backend integration. The next step is the authentication flows in our application and to protect our screens based on the authentication status of a user. So if a user is not authenticated, we should always redirect him to the sign-in page. And if a user is authenticated, we should redirect away from the sign-in page to the home screen, for example. And at the same time, protect the users from being able to navigate to the routes that he should not have access unless he is authenticated. I will leave a couple of links to the guides of these authentication flows. So if you're using React Navigation, there is this guide for authentication flows that explains how you can display different screens based on the authentication status. But in our case, we are using Expert Router, so we're gonna follow this guide for the authentication that will help us implement it using the Expert Router. So I don't want to simply copy paste everything, so we're gonna develop it step by step together. What we need first is a context that is going to contain data about our authentication status, which we will be able to use in all our screens to know, like, is the user authenticated or not. Let's go ahead and create a new folder, context, that will contain files with contexts. The first one is going to be auth context.tsx. First steps first is let's define this auth context using the create context function from React, like this. Now let's define a provider. So auth context provider is going to be a React component that will render the auth context.provider here, and inside of the provider we will render all the children that we will receive as the children of this auth context provider when we will encapsulate our screens with it. So children, we can do props with children, and here we can go ahead and render them here. The auth context provider expects a value which will represent like the actual value of our context. And what will we store in this auth context? Well, the most important thing is we're gonna store the token, the JWT token. So for that, we're gonna need a state variable for the auth token, set auth token, which is equal to use state, and initially it's going to be null. This use state should be imported from React, so use state. And if we provide also types, it should be string or null. Let's go ahead and export this auth token as a value. And should we also export the set authentication token? Let's go ahead and export it as well. Make sure to export this auth context provider component as default. So export context provider, and we need to do it by default. And what we're going to do with it, we're going to wrap our whole application inside this auth context provider. So in Expert Router, that is going to be in our app layout file. And let's import auth context provider, and let's go ahead and wrap our whole application in auth context provider like this inside our root layout navigation. In our authentication screens, specifically in our screen where we receive the JWT token, we should be able to update the authentication token from our context provider. Basically, we need to get access to this context and to call the set authentication token that we export here. What we will do to get access to this context is we're going to export a const, a custom hook called use authentication, which will help us get access to the context using the use context hook, and by providing this specific context here. Use context hook is another hook that we need to import from React. And now using this use authentication, we can get access to the set authentication token function inside our authenticate page. Here, the name of this function should be authenticate, actually. Export default authenticate. And using that hook, we can get access to equal use set auth token. So using this setter, we can go ahead and call set auth token with a response dot what's going to be the auth token. That's going to be the value of our response. That's what we saw in the logs. So let's go ahead in auth context and do a console log here to make sure that we are properly setting authentication token. So console.log auth token equal auth token. So now if we look in the logs, we should see, let me maybe clear. If I refresh, we should see auth token null because we are not yet signed in. That's okay. Let's go ahead and simulate a user creating a new account. For the confirm code, I'm going to take it from my email, confirm, and we see that it automatically updated the auth token in our context, and now it has an authentication token. At the same time, if we have an authentication token, that means that we are authenticated and we can safely redirect the user back to the home page, right? So how do we do that? Well, we will do that using some listeners and using some effects based on authentication token and also based on the URL where the user is currently on. What I mean by that is let's get the, how is it called? The segments of the path from Expo router, use segments from Expo router. It was imported automatically. And if I do console log here segments, should be segment, you're gonna see what it contains. So this array contains the segments drawer, then tabs, then feed. It's basically all the parts of a URL that are separated by the slash. And in our project, that represents our directories. So as you can see, the drawer is drawer, then tabs, tabs, then feed, feed. If we are on the authentication page, this contains authentication, then sign in. So this is a way to understand where the user currently is. So based on these two things, where the user is and whether he is authenticated or not, we can understand like if he is supposed to be there or not, or where he is supposed to be in terms of what screens. So let's do a use effect that will always be executed when either the segment or the authentication token is going to update. To understand if he is currently on some screens that do not require authentication, basically is auth group, we can check if segments at position 0 is equal to authentication, to auth like this, because that's our first part of a segment for the authentication screens. Then what we can do is we can decide where the user should be. So if the user is not authenticated, so if authentication token is null, he is not in the authentication group, that means that he is on a screen that he is not supposed to see. In that case, what we should do is we should redirect him back to the sign-in screen. To redirect, we need access to the router, so use router from Expo router, and we're going to use not push but router dot replace because we don't want him to be able to go back to some screens. So replace slash sign in. Otherwise, if I can do another if statement here, but if he is authenticated, which means that he has an authentication token and he is in the authentication group, that means that he shouldn't be there. He should be on the home screen. So router.replace, and let's redirect him to the feed or even to the home screen like slash. But if we redirect to the slash, we should make sure to go to our index and define the home screen as the feed. It will still redirect back to the sign in because we specified that. And we can have a look in our auth context and say console log user is not yet authenticated and he cannot see this page. So right now, if I'm gonna refresh the page and look into the logs, that's exactly what we see. User is not yet authenticated and he cannot see this page because the segments, if I will also run console log the segments, we would see that we were on the feed screen. But now if I'm going to sign in by dim at notJust.dev, get the code, put the code here and press confirm, now I'm redirected. And how it happens? It happens because router replaces our screen with the slash, and in the slash, which is our index, redirects us to the feed. And now we cannot go back because we are already signed in. The thing is that if we refresh, we're still gonna go from the first part because we are not persisting the JWT token, our authentication token yet, but at least our authentication flow is working properly as we expect it to work. So when there is no authentication token and the user is not in the authentication group, we want him to redirect back to the sign-in page. And if he has an authentication token and he is still in the authentication group, we want to redirect him to the home page, to the home screen. So that's how we basically gatekeep different screens based on the authentication status of the user. So let me do git add, git commit auth protected routes. Okay, we have two more things to do. We have to, first of all, persist our authentication token. So the second time we're going to refresh the application, we're not going to have to go through the same process again. Our application will remember that, hey, the user was signed in and will write this authentication token in storage. To do that, we can use some libraries that will help us write on our device storage. We can use async storage, but that is not a secure way to store tokens. A better way would be to use Expo Secure Store, and this will allow to store data on the storage, which is encrypted. So to do that, we're gonna install firstly Expo Secure Store in our React Native application, npx expo install, and using the secure store.setItemAsync and getItemAsync, we're gonna be able to write and get our authentication token. So where should that happen? That should happen in the authentication auth context provider. And first of all, we need to save that token whenever we are updating it here. Instead of exposing the set auth token function here, what I will do is actually, let's go ahead and do update auth token. This is going to be a function that will receive the new token as string, and we're gonna expose this update authentication token from here. We want to make sure that in our screen authenticate, we are not calling the set auth token, but update auth token. And in our auth context, what we want to do here is let's go ahead and first of all set it in state, set auth token in state. And also we want to save it on the device storage using secure store. So for that, we're going to import secure store like this. And yeah, besides saving it in state, we will also want to do await secure store.save set item async. Here we need to provide a key and a value. The key is going to be auth token and the value is going to be new token. I'm thinking to do it the other way around, to first save it in on the device storage and then update it in state, because updating it in state will redirect the user. So yeah, let's make sure that first the token is saved and then it's redirected. And because this is an async function in the authenticate screen, we should also make sure to await here to update the authentication token. Perfect. The second step is reading this authentication token when the application mounts. So to do that, we're gonna add a new use effect with an empty dependency list that will load the auth token. So load auth token is going to be an async function that should be called right away. And in this async function, let's do const response. As well, we're gonna await the secure store using get method, and using the same key, we are going to be able to access it from the secure store. So what we can do is we can set backend state, set auth token as response. We can do a if statement to make sure like it's available before we set it in state like this. So now refreshing, possible unhandled rejection. Let's see why is that happening. Cannot read property get item async of undefined. I think I imported it incorrectly. Yes, I need to import everything as secure store from Expo secure store. And now let's try to log in again. Sign in. We're gonna receive a code on email. Confirm. We are redirected to the home screen, and hopefully we also persisted and saved the authentication token on the device storage. And if I refresh the application, if everything works, we should automatically be redirected to the feed. And that's exactly what happens. We are automatically redirected to the feed. So if I update refresh right now, we are back here. Perfect. So now the user will not have to always log in. He will log in once and the application will remember the authentication token and will use that authentication token for future requests. So let's go ahead and commit this. And the next step is going to be to actually make sure that our API is using the authentication token from the context provider, because right now if we're looking in the config here, that was manually set here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove this authentication token from here because it shouldn't be hard coded. It should be taken dynamically. And let's think how we're going to get this data in our functions for the authorization. Because our API methods, they need access to authentication token. We have two options of getting this authentication token in these functions. One of them is through parameters, because our authentication token is provided, is available through our auth context. So there is no easy way to get it directly here in the list tweets, because these functions are not as part of a React tree. They are being called from the React tree, and in that moment, for example, in the new tweet, here we would be able to get the authentication token and send it down to the create tweet function. But I really don't like this approach because it will imply that every time we are using mutations or queries, every time we would get the authentication token. So I think a better approach is to transform these functions into a React context as well. And this way the functions will have access to the authentication token themselves. So they will not depend on extra parameters. So let's see how we would do that. So first of all, let's say this is tweets API context. It's a create context. We're going to create a context with create context. From here, let's go ahead and create that tweets API context provider that will receive children and will return back the tweets API context dot provider. And yeah, let me close this one. It doesn't want to autocomplete because my file is not a TSX file, but it's a TS file. So I can rename it to TSX tweet context provider. And here, let's go ahead and add the children. We need to provide the value here, and the children can be typed as props with children. Now, what we can do is let's go ahead and bring all these functions. I'm going to copy all of them. Let's bring it as part of this component. Because they are part of this component, we don't need the export from here, like this. Now, because we are part of a React component, what we can do is we can use the authentication context and we can get from there the auth token like this, use auth. That is a context managing the authentication. And now our list tweets and so on, they will handle authorization themselves. And the last step is to go ahead and export them inside this value. So list tweets, get tweet and also create tweet. So we are exporting this way the functions. And lastly, I also want to export from here a helper hook. So const use tweet API that will get us access using the use context to this tweets API context like this. Now we need to wrap our application inside this tweets context provider. For that, we need to export it as default, export default tweets context provider. And inside our layout, we're going to import similar way how we did for our authentication context for our tweets API context provider. And let's wrap it our screens in this tweets API context provider, but make sure that it's below the authentication context, because our API is dependent on the authentication token. So it's here. And let's go ahead in our application where we are using, for example, in the new tweet, instead of importing it like this from API tweets, we're going to import the use tweets API, and we're going to get access to that function, create tweet, from this use tweets API hook, like this. And the same way in our drawer, for example, tabs feed index, instead of getting list tweets from there, we're gonna get use tweets API, and we're gonna get access to the list tweets from the use tweets API. And same way as in the tweet, that's the last place, instead of get tweet. And this way, it's loading. I think it's gonna fail, but we're gonna see why. Let's go ahead in our lib tweets tsx here and try to console log this auth token. So it's there, but it's still saying not authorized. Let's try to see if this token is actually working by calling list tweets and changing here the headers, the authorization header. Send. It says 200. Okay. Why might it not work? List tweets auth token. So inside list tweets, it's null. Why is it null inside this function? Oh my God, it was doing these queries even before we load the authentication token. And because it was scheduling this request multiple times, it was always doing them with null. And until it reached the point where it was no longer doing these requests. So that's why in all of these functions, we should make sure to check, first of all, if the authentication token is there, and only then to fetch, otherwise to stop the fetching process like this. And yeah, I can go back to this structure. Tweets data is undefined. That should come somewhere from drawer tabs feed index, and tweets data is undefined. In the drawer layout here, I know that all of these screens are screens that depend on the authentication token, so I can get the auth token from the use authentication, and as long as we don't have authentication token yet, I can return an activity indicator. In this way, we're not gonna even get there. And now when we get there, we know that we have an authentication token, and now it's working perfectly. Yes. Okay, that's good. Okay, so let's go ahead and do git add, git commit -m auth use token from context. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video where we implemented passwordless authentication flow, where the user is able to sign in our application using his email only. So it was quite a challenging process, but I hope you learned something new today. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell not to miss any future videos that we're gonna make.